Good. So welcome. My name is John van Etten. It's Wednesday at 2 o'clock, so we're doing our regular human synergistics topic for the week. So again, my name is John van Etten. I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics office here in Germany. And we have 1 hour to talk about today's topic, which is called Organizational Stages of Consciousness. So to give proper credit, everything I'm presenting today is not only human synergistics content, but is really coming from Sean McCarthy, the Australian office. So this is not necessarily the newest information. I think this was published around 2014, but it may not have made it to this part of the world. So I thought it would be a great topic to discuss with you today. So again, the PowerPoint and actually the paper that I've shared are originally by Sean McCarthy of our Australian office. The paper and research behind it were actually done by Professor Dexter Dunphy and Corinne Cantor of the Australian office. So, and that little research into organizational stages of consciousness resulted in the paper that you will see when you follow the Hightail folder. So this is our topic today. I'm actually really excited about it because I think it's an interesting topic sort of in and of itself. A lot of times you, the accredited practitioners, especially accredited in culture, I think understand culture and how we measure that and how we look at that in terms of circumplex profiles. But this stages of consciousness discussion is interesting because it sort of takes a different perspective. You get to see sort of how organizations view and understand culture when we look across the clients that we work with. How do they understand culture? How do they understand the importance of it? These sorts of topics. So I'm going to try to share my screen. So again, this is an interesting one because it looks at how organizations sort of address culture across the businesses that we work with. It's also, I think, really interesting content because it tells you a lot about sort of where a business may be currently. Again, how they understand culture, how leaders understand their influence and the effects that that has. It really, in many cases, I think as you as accredited consultants will kind of connect with this information because it explains a lot in terms of things like the receptiveness that leaders may show to these topics. I have a lot of accredited consultants who talk about not just things like consciousness, but awareness of leadership teams, even in some cases, perhaps the maturity of leadership teams in being aware of these topics and sort of taking them seriously, I suppose. So hopefully this will connect with your experience as well. So as I go through the PowerPoints, if I can move this menu. Good. A very nice point here is that we're really going to talk about several key questions that a lot of our clients and accredited practitioners have. So questions around things like what influences an organization's ability to handle complexity. I was just talking about this with a few clients recently when we talk about things like complex strategies, complex change that's taken place in the business, the new way of working, complex organizational structures, matrix style organizations, and so on. What enables and influences the ability of the business and members in those organizations to handle that level of complexity. Another topic question is why is it the very common question, why is it when we copy initiatives that seem to have functioned in one organization and they fail to function in another? So this speaks to the point of, if you have been a consultant or have heard of consultants who may use very effective methods to develop leaders and culture in a given business, They then take those very same strategies and methods to another organization, and it does not have the desired effect, even though we're sort of doing the same things. There are a few good reasons for this. Usually I talk about that in terms of organizational climate, but there's also a very important topic here in terms of organizational consciousness, and really the ability of leaders and the business to recognize the need and implement things effectively. So we'll talk about that. Why organizations, here's a key one, stop working on culture when things get tough. So I've talked, always talk in accreditation about this. We also talk about this in project design around building a case for change in terms of how we design projects. But why is it so frustratingly that some of our clients, and in some cases with these insights, I think you'll be able to actually predict when this may happen, or those organizations that are most at risk for this. But why is it that some leadership teams and some businesses, even when they go through a nice OCI, OEI project and have all of this good data, sort of fail to put things into action and make a change? And how does the way that leaders think about culture and leadership influence their approach, their culture, and their ability to grow? And the final question, I believe, is, are there identifiable stages of organizational development? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, this comes from Professor Dexter Dunphy's research. He published an earlier book called Organizational Change and Corporate Sustainability, where the topic of organizational consciousness is brought up. Here is what we're talking about in terms of what do we mean by a conscious organization. So these are organizations that have a high resolution or a lot of clarity and awareness around the purpose of the organization, how it influences its customers, employees, shareholders, and the wider community. The organization is one in which there's a deliberate translation of that purpose into specific initiatives and strategy. So we know what the purpose of the business is clearly, who we serve and how we do that, and we deliberately and effectively put that into practice and strategy. These organizations are characterized by a proactive mindset to change, actively engaging with and influencing the context within which the organization operates. So essentially consciously aware, understanding our situation, and able to adapt as needed. The organizations are also typically characterized by a long-term focusing on long-term effectiveness rather than short-term targets. Okay, with that understanding in terms of what we're describing as consciousness within an organization, then we can introduce the model that Dr. Dunphy and Sean McCarthy have used to map this out. So I believe we have kind of a step-by-step. So essentially this is a Johari's window. The first dimension that we're looking at has to do with leadership. So I think those of you who are accredited understand the extent to which leadership and the awareness that leaders have and the seriousness with which they address culture has a key role. So this dimension, it might be a little small to read, is referring to leadership. On the left-hand side, really no belief versus high commitment. This is the understanding that leaders have in terms of, firstly, that culture is a thing and that it influences the performance of their people and their business. So whether they have no understanding or belief in that concept, up to clear understanding and high commitment. The other dimension is with reference to our circumplex and the culture itself of these organizations, essentially a vertical dimension referring to more defensive cultural norms versus more constructive norms. On the lower left, this essentially creates sort of 4 quadrants, very much along Johari windows type structures. On the lower left, we have stagnating kinds of consciousness, unfortunately, in which we have leaders with very little belief or awareness around cultural topics, and at the same time, a security-oriented organizational culture. On the upper left, this quadrant is defined by, that previous quadrant is defined as stagnating. We don't have awareness and we don't have a proactive, goal-oriented, collaborative culture. The upper left quadrant is defined by risk. This is where we seem to have a constructive organizational culture, but leadership is not particularly clear potentially on what that culture is or how the culture is related to the performance of the business. This is a risk because even if you manage to create such a constructive culture in the absence of kind of aware leaders, it's probably potentially not sustainable and certainly at risk that that culture could devolve over time if leaders don't pay attention and understand what this is. On the lower right-hand side, we have unrealized potential. So this is a quadrant in which leaders may realize that culture is important, but we have a primarily defensive culture that is not enabling us to use and implement the potential that we have and are maybe becoming aware of. Upper right-hand side, we have sustainability and performance, again, relating to an organization which is functional, productive, effective, and is able to adapt and change as needed moving forward. So those are the general quadrants. Vulnerability versus potential is sort of a dimension that we can put along the bottom as well. And then essentially what we're doing is mapping organizations based on these two criteria, their current operating culture and the awareness of their leadership. So the first piece that you can see appearing here is labeled denial. So these are organizations in which the leadership teams essentially are either unaware or in denial about the extent to which culture is influencing their performance. So just a few really nice key descriptions here of what this stage is. So no awareness or acknowledgement of the role that culture plays in organizational performance. The belief system is one in which we see culture as a term here is airy fairy. I think that's a bit Australian. We might say intangible or maybe fluffy is the right term in this part of the world. But yeah, something that requires, does not require investment or really conscious development. Kind of a nice to have, but not something that is important or effectual. The leadership team is likely to oppose initiatives related to culture measurement or even development, seeing it as a waste of time, unnecessary, superfluous, and so on. These organizations in general are characterized by a fairly short-term performance horizon. So if you talk to them or look at how they assess and measure things like performance, you'll find that it's fairly short-term oriented. They're very sort of narrow in that focus. Yeah, and there's a focus on where we are here and now with not a lot of attention on moving forward and long-term orientation. So all of that together, I mean, a lot of this is cultural and also along the lines of consciousness, but really in a nutshell, this leads to organizations and a culture that are unsustainable in terms of their performance. And they're really sort of strategically based on exploitation of resources, both within and outside of the organization, which ultimately tends to be vulnerable over time and unsustainable. So now again, as I mentioned, giving full credit, this is Sean McCarthy in the Australian office's presentation. So they've included their own data here. Maybe we'll do this again at some point and we'll include data from our client bases. I was going through this presentation beforehand and there are some differences in our part of the world, but for the most part, I agree with their numbers. So basically they're saying that they see about 10% of their client organizations in their part of the world that fall into this denial stage. Each of these stages, I think you may be getting this now, it sort of has its own challenges. And a lot of times I think we only see 10% of organizations at this stage because these organizations don't really realize that maybe culture even exists within their business. They certainly don't understand how it connects to things like values or influences performance. And those are the organizations in many cases that are most difficult for us human synergistics to really even start a dialogue with and sort of to get in contact with initially in any case. Again, because of their awareness and sort of the stage of consciousness that they're in. The second stage is what's described as non-responsive. I love the graphic for this. Very, very telling. So what is the non-responsive stage of consciousness? This is described as there being some awareness of the role of culture and its impact on organizational performance, but it's really not seen as a key or significant factor. Generally, culture is viewed with indifference. There's no real belief that we need to focus on it, and not a clear understanding and how it drives the performance of the business. Executive teams will either exhibit no commitment or low commitment to addressing culture and potentially leadership development. They may place some lip service, as we say, to this issue, which means they may say that it's an important thing to their business and maybe along the lines of things like values, but nothing really actually happens in terms of measurement or action. The organizations are described again in terms of being short-term, more reactive, but still short-term oriented, and really only moving into action if forced. Otherwise, they tend not to change. To be honest with you, I think we're starting to see some of these organizations today, because organizations in this stage really only reach out to consultants or to human synergistics on the topic of culture along the lines down here that were just mentioned, sort of if we're forced to. So you might be surprised at how many of the new clients that we're in communication with these days who are saying, well, we think we might need to look at culture because, you know, the new way of working, the home office experience, is something that we're now forced to look at. How do we lead our people, communicate goals, these sorts of things with this remote structure? Now we're sort of in a way forced to address culture. So we're starting to hear from more of these, what have been non-responsive organizations. In any case, the outcome tends to be attempting to maintain the status quo, not change unless we are forced and it's absolutely necessary, and so on. All right. So this brings us to how many of these do we see? This is probably, they're saying 42% of the organizations that they're in touch with. I would agree that this is a large cut of our client base as well, especially when they're initially in touch with us. They recognize a need and an immediate pressure to change. Again, these are the organizations that we hear from when they are failing to work remotely in teams. They're failing to merge their organizations effectively in an M&A kind of situation. They recognize that there is some kind of immediate failure or need to change, and that's the time at which we may hear from them. All right, so moving up the ladder, if you will, we get to the compliance stage. This is also a group that we hear quite a bit from. At this stage of understanding culture, we tend to fall into the trap of recognizing that culture is a thing, but trying to categorize this as a good thing or a bad thing. Do we have the right culture or the wrong culture? If our culture is bad, how do we create a good culture? Hopefully for those of you who are accredited, you're recognizing this is not the kind of language that is appropriate for describing organizational culture, but it is something that organizations in this compliance stage of consciousness seem to apply to organizational culture. The reason for that is they're really looking at it as a performance criteria, and that's really the primary way that I think they view culture. There's a desire to measure culture. They see it as a KPI, something that they understand is related to performance, and they want to understand. They see it as a nice to have, and it needs to be consistent with, sort of compliant with the organization's practices of data collection. So if we're going to look at KPIs, if we're going to understand the importance of engagement, we also recognize that culture is a thing, and we begin to have an interest in measuring that as well. Leadership teams tend to have increased commitment at this level of consciousness, but they tend not to take culture as, take the leadership role, if you will, in terms of culture. They tend to think culture is something like other HR issues, maybe engagement or employee satisfaction. It's something for HR to take responsibility of, or OD departments. So seen as important, but not something that leaders see as themselves maybe owning and leading directly. Good. Again, we're still focusing on short term, although medium term and future oriented thinking is stronger in these kinds of organizations. The emphasis, though, is on compliance. So we want to measure our culture to make sure that nothing is wrong or bad, that kind of perspective. Small changes tend to be implemented in these kinds of organizations. The outcome is really around assessment. The intention is measurement with little consideration beyond this. So again, we do have a lot of organizations that fall into this category. Again, we understand that culture is a thing. We may not recognize whether our culture is what it should be, but we want to measure it, kind of understand it, and see whether it's right, wrong, good, bad, and fits within our expectations. So again, a different kind of place where these organizations are starting. It means I think we need to have a different kind of communication with them when we start talking with them. Organizations, when I talk to organizations that seem to be sort of at this level of consciousness, my focus is to get a lot of input around the KPI performance criteria that they're interested in. This is also, by the way, true of some of the other previous stages, because that's really, if they're going to understand the importance of culture, that's really the context in which they'll be most interested. Culture's nice, but we really get interested in it when we realize that culture is driving, the ability of our people to make decisions, and our communication effectiveness, and our engagement, and our customer focus, and all of those things. So organizations in this area, I'm very focused on trying to figure out what those performance criteria are. And I'm also typically trying to have a conversation with them around the difference between what we describe as outcomes, which you can think about in terms of good and bad. Is the stress level in this organization good or bad? Is the way in which our people make decisions, is that timely, or does it take forever and things aren't getting done? You can assign sort of positive and negative connotations to outcome criteria. It's not something that you can apply to organizational culture. We talk about culture, as you know, in terms of satisfaction, security. You can talk about it in terms of what is promoting performance versus detracting performance, what is consistent with values or inconsistent, what is helping us move forward versus what is holding us back. But viewing it in terms of good, bad, and right and wrong should not typically be done. So anyway, just trying to give you some insights of how to connect with clients at these various stages, I guess. All right, so once we understand the compliance level, then we tend to get up to the efficiency level. So this is getting to the stage in which culture is not something that at the compliance level, we're looking at culture from a perspective that the culture needs to fit our business. Now we're really realizing that culture drives performance, and we're starting to realize that if we could develop the culture, we could develop higher levels of performance. So this is what really starts to kick off this first point around there's a belief that we need to change. Things may be going well in the business or not, but we recognize that things can be improved through culture development. The belief system is one around, again, the measurement of outcomes is very relevant, and we see culture as a way to optimize our human capital and to drive those performance criteria. Leaders tend to be interested in results measurement, as I've mentioned before, as a means of making the systems and processes more efficient, more effective. So this is a lot of looking at culture through the lens of efficiency and effectiveness, and how do we tune the culture, if you will, in order to make the organization function and run more efficiently, more smoothly, more effectively. It's characterized by, well, a focus on sort of both short, medium, and long-term effects. There is a much clearer understanding of cause and effect in these organizations. We're not looking, as previously we were, as culture as an outcome, as another thing like engagement or satisfaction. But now we understand that one thing precedes the other. There is a cause and effect relationship, and that if we want to address performance, we need to develop culture. Good. And again, focused on optimizing systems and processes is really the focus. To be honest with you, this efficiency stage is what I talk to clients about when I'm talking to clients at earlier stages, if you will. So if you're talking to a client that's, you know, at the compliance stage, and then what I try to do is talk to them about really in a way of leading them up the next step. If you really look at each of these stages of consciousness, it has to do with a learning and an awareness really amongst leaders in terms of things like, does culture exist? If it exists, what is it? If we understand what it is, can we describe what it is here and what it should be here? If we can understand that, then can we understand how it influences the performance of our business? If we can understand that, then can we understand the importance of potentially changing and improving the culture in a way that promotes performance? So it's really a series of questions and learnings for leadership teams. And one of the key tricks that I've learned is to try to figure out where your client is or where the leaders are that you're speaking with. Talk to them at sort of their level of consciousness, if you will, to answer those questions, but then to try to lead them up to the next step in understanding. And that's much of what we do for our clients, is lead them along these stages. Okay, so now we're getting into the efficiency stage. Again, here they're saying about 12% of their clients. I would tend to agree with that, maybe a little bit more. Of course, as I already mentioned, we are developing clients, so many times we come into contact, and I could tell you stories about clients where when we met them, they were very much in the non-responsive area. Then we really made a case for change, and we showed them other clients who've benefited in their industry or whatever it took to answer their questions. And then they sort of moved up to the compliance stage. Okay, maybe this culture thing is a thing. Maybe we should measure it and see what's taking place, just like we do for other factors. Then they measure it, and especially things like the nice correlations in the back of the reports help them to understand not just what the culture is, which is their question at that compliance level, but then what could we do to make things more efficient? And that's starting to lead them into higher levels of consciousness. Hopefully that makes sense. Which now brings us to strategic proactivity. So now we're getting into the more sort of consciously aware stages. So these are businesses in which we make a case for change, and it is clearly articulated. Organizations are committed to these journeys. Change is seen as an ongoing process and not as a simple event. So previously, where we might be looking at culture, if I can back up, you know, through the efficiency stage and saying, yes, we could make faster decisions if we had a little bit more achievement, or our people would work more effectively in a remote setting if the culture were more humanistic, encouraging. So we're doing little initiatives potentially for certain parts of the business, specifically with respect to an outcome criteria or performance that we want to improve. Now we're getting bigger and broader. Now we're understanding that it's not just, you know, culture for better communication or culture for engagement, but But by creating a constructive culture, we really create the kind of environment in which your employees can contribute most effectively and can experience, higher levels of well-being. And therefore, by focusing on culture, and this is really the stage, I think, where clients begin to take, as I sometimes say, their attention off of outcomes. So they stop focusing exclusively on employee satisfaction, stress, engagement, discretionary effort, and so on and so forth. And they start moving their attention toward culture, and realizing that as a leadership team, we cannot control the level of stress that our people experience. We cannot control their level of engagement. What we can do is shape the culture and create the kind of culture and the kind of workplace where people see an opportunity, they understand how to contribute, they know what their role is, so on and so forth, to contribute to not only their own performance, but the business. So this is really the level at which I think leaders get the big picture and stop taking their attention off of the immediate outcomes and start understanding how the system is truly functioning within their organization. That's really why, if you look down here at the executive team, people start taking this much more on board. Leadership becomes strong advocates, not only because they understand the importance of culture, but they understand their role in shaping it. The outcome tends to be true transformational change. This is valued as it delivers results. The organization aligns itself rapidly to changing environments and takes leadership positions. So this is a much more forward-thinking, adaptive organization that is one in which leaders understand not only the business and strategy, but the culture by which we fulfill that strategy. Okay. 14% of organizations in this area, I would have to do the math. I'm concerned we might not have quite that percentage. But again, it has to do with the extent to which organizations develop to this point. To be honest with you, around this stage, I would say it's fairly rare for us to come into contact with organizations that are at this sort of strategic, proactive level of consciousness. We're usually getting in touch with them around compliance and efficiency stages. So we know culture's a thing, we know it has an effect, but we don't know what our culture is. We don't know if it's helping or hindering. And we really don't understand the role of leadership or how culture is well, not an outcome, but is something that to be managed and focused upon. So those are the kinds of conversations and the level at which I'm typically familiar with connecting with clients, and then hopefully moving them up as we work with them to these higher levels. And we do have organizations in those higher levels today as a function of a lot of the understanding they've gained from HS tools. Okay, so now, sorry, we get to the very last stage, all the way in the upper right, described as sustaining. So the sustaining or resilient stage is characterized by a case for ongoing change is seen as integral to the organization's ongoing commitment to developing its economy, its performance, and socially. So rather than changing the culture to fix an issue, we start to see culture as almost the sort of the thermometer by which we judge the psychological health of the organization, and really becomes the area of focus for leadership teams. Again, much more primarily than outcome type criteria, which most businesses do focus on. Culture becomes a topic of continuous measurement and development, really becoming the focal point for leaders to understand how we do what we do and how I have an impact in this business. Leaders begin to see the belief and commitment comes fully from integrating their personal values with the organization's culture. So one of the things you may be noticing at this sort of final stage is First of all, we shift from a fixing a problem perspective to a maintaining a healthy organization type of perspective. Sort of like when you go to your doctor, there's a difference between going to the doctor because there's a problem that I need to fix, and going to the doctor for a checkup to see what I can do to be my best and healthiest. And that's really what we're talking about here, is more proactive action around development and maintaining a healthy culture. The other thing that you'll tend to notice in these final stages is it becomes less about performance, where it was in the earlier stages around compliance and efficiency, and it starts to become more about values. And you notice that in this point about the executive team, and also about sort of understanding what we do as an organization. It's the culture and the values start to merge, which of course is always something we try to talk about, focusing on the developing the culture that you want within the organization, OCI ideal as your target. And making decisions as a leader based on what is right and values, not exclusively on outcomes and what's going to get us results. Thankfully, I think, as you know, that's generally the same thing, but it's a big leap for leaders to take their attention off of making decisions because it's going to drive the right performance, and start making decisions because it's based on the right values. And here we really begin to shift into longer term and more sustainable performance. And performance is redefined as adding value to all stakeholders. So one of the things many times I talk about in culture is, how do leadership teams define performance? Is it profitability? Is it customer satisfaction? How do we understand that we are an effective organization? It's a very interesting sort of point for leaders and for you as consultants, because it does speak to these different levels of consciousness. If you talk to a leadership team and you ask them what is performance, and really for them it is being profitable and making money, and at the end of the day that's really all that matters to them, you can bet that they're in one of those pretty early stages of consciousness around understanding, how do we achieve that? Nothing wrong with that, of course, but there's a lot more to creating revenue than wanting to. We need to know how we do that strategically. How does the business create profitability? How do we function? Who do we serve? How do we fulfill the roles that need to be done in order to get there? And that's all of the culture and leadership steps that really have to be directly managed before profitability and sustainability can really ever be achieved. So this is really the awareness that we're looking for in our clients, hopefully that you have as consultants, in terms of, or accredited individuals, both in terms of understanding not only what culture is, but understanding how critical it is as a driving force within the organization, that it's critical to help our clients to focus on culture and not just the outcomes that result from it, and to put their focus on that as the thing in their business that they can truly affect to improve the organization. And also, of course, to implement this and to weave in, if you will, the topic of values, and moving toward an organization that's not only more highly performing, but consistent with the values of the business. Australia is reporting about 2% of organizations that they have in this higher echelon. I might have to agree with that. It is unfortunately fairly rare. The trend amongst our clients certainly is moving up this progression. But again, as I mentioned before, we tend to get in touch with clients. You can actually see the percentages here that have been included by the Australian office. And this really is true. We tend to get in touch with clients in these non-responsive and compliance type stages, and then work with them to develop their cultures and also to develop the awareness of their leaders, so that we can help them move up to higher levels, not only of more constructive cultures, but higher levels of awareness, so that we're more effective in implementing culture, developing culture. We're more effective as leaders in shaping it. Okay, a few numbers are going to pop up on the right-hand side of the slide here. It's just talking about basically the cultures toward the top versus the bottom of this model. Unfortunately, you know, when you look across each of these stages, you're seeing what I'm seeing, which is most of the client organizations, so the businesses that we're in touch with, and keep in mind that's a big a skewed sample right there, right? Because these are the clients that we're in touch with. But most of them are either non-responsive or looking at this from a compliance or efficiency kind of perspective in terms of what is culture going to get us in terms of performance. Much fewer organizations in these higher levels. You can see that if we simply cut across the top and bottom, only 16% are really in these more constructive and more aware levels versus 84% that are catching up. And on the upper right here, you'll see that those organizations in this upper piece with the more constructive, more aware leadership teams experience, these are Australian numbers, but we very much see the same patterns, much higher levels of things like employee satisfaction and engagement, higher levels of role clarity. Here's the adaptability that everyone is shaking our tree about these days in terms of developing more adaptive organizational cultures. This is how we get there, higher quality and service. Unfortunately, of course, at the bottom of this, we're seeing more stress in those organizations that are more defensive and less aware, much higher levels of job insecurity, people being more likely to leave those organizations, and other similar outcome patterns that I think you're familiar with. Good. So I very much like this model. I think it's a nice way to understand where organizations and leadership teams are, especially when we immediately are kind of put in contact with them. It very much helps, I think, you as a consultant. I think it very much helps me to think about where are these leaders and where is this organization now in terms of their understanding. It really does not help, in my experience, to start talking to clients about these higher order values and things that we would talk about in the sustaining and strategic levels when they're down here at the non-responsive level. We need to talk to them about where they are, answer the questions that they have at this point, and take them on the journey. And in a way, this is very much along the lines of what a culture journey is, helping people to understand what is their culture currently, how does that connect to performance, and that's in compliance. How might we tweak the culture to get more performance? Hey, wait a minute, it's really not about performance. This is really all about culture, and we can start taking our eye off of engagement and start focusing on culture. Then we can affect the things that we can affect and truly drive performance, and then starting to get up to the sustaining stages. So it's really a conversation. It's really a journey that we take our clients on. And I think it's super helpful information for you, the consultant, because it really does predict the questions that your clients will have at these levels, the concerns that they have that prevent them from taking the next step, and really the kinds of things that we need to do and explain to them to help them on their journeys. So again, these were some of the questions that we asked at the very beginning. What influences complexity and the ability of organizations to handle that? I think as accredited practitioners, you understand that that has a whole lot to do with constructive norms and the ability of people to function effectively within complex environments and work structures. That kind of complexity is something that constructive cultures are capable of flourishing within. And that's the kind of thing that organizations need to be aware of. The next point of why when we copy a culture initiative from one organization to another, it might not work. You may be dealing with an organization at a different level of consciousness. You know, talking to an organization that is in the non-responsive stage, as I mentioned before, about, you know, the importance of living your values might be a few steps too far. At that stage, what we need to talk to them about is clarifying that culture is a thing and demonstrating to them in terms of how their culture is influencing their performance. So we really need to know the audience, I guess, that we're speaking to, and therefore what's going to sort of stick for them. Why some organizations stop working on cultures. Now, this is this is one of my biggest frustrations. We work with, and really from this model, you can see how I say we oftentimes know in advance which organizations, unfortunately, are going to do this. And what I mean is they may be interested in culture. They may reach out to us and conduct a project. They then receive their wonderful OCI, OEI reports that give them great information and could create so much awareness, but instead they choose to do nothing with it. And really never embark on that change. And I can connect this now to what we've just talked about. If you think back to that compliance stage, that's a stage of consciousness in which we tend to think about culture in terms of good and bad and right and wrong. And one of the biggest challenges that I experience when we talk to clients at that level is when we deliver their reports to them, there's always going to be a gap between the current and the ideal. And those organizations at that level of consciousness will tend to see that gap as wrong. We are not living the talk. We're not living the values. We are doing the wrong things. Our culture is wrong. That kind of negative perspective then causes them to, obviously, leaders are going to see themselves as being held accountable for this to some extent, and HR starts to get nervous that we're going to be held accountable, and that security-oriented culture begins to play out. And those are the organizations that are at greatest risk to simply do nothing with this information. Unfortunately, it's very predictable once we have their profiles, but it also speaks directly to the level of consciousness that they are within right now. How do leaders think about culture and how they influence it? I mean, this is really one of the chicken and the egg things. I was going to try to talk about organizational consciousness in terms of whether this is a climate factor or whether this is an outcome. But it's really a great example of one of those times that it's both. The consciousness of your leaders and whether they understand culture and its influence is a hugely powerful climate factor that will drive how the culture plays out. At the same time, defensive cultural norms will tend to encourage leaders to either believe that culture is not an important thing or feel that it's something that they don't want to address or don't need to address, these sorts of things. So they really do create sort of a vicious cycle between what leaders think and how they understand the culture and their role, and thereby how that culture and their role plays out. And the final question, are there identifiable stages of organizational consciousness and development? I think there very much are. And I really do like, if I can go back to the model, this method of understanding them and really helping, therefore, to really focus on, again, where the client is and help them to take the next step. It's a great way to kind of conceptualize that. All right, we've got 10 minutes left, which is about where I hoped to stop so that we can turn this over to questions. Thank you again to Sean McCarthy in the Australian office for sharing all of that. And you also, of course, also do have the article as well. So, stop sharing this. So you have that additional input for you. So I'd like to take a break here, have a sip of coffee, and see if there are any questions from your side about this perspective and organizational stages of consciousness.
May I ask a question, John?
Yes, of course, Mr. Hans.
If you look at the current profile of the 2%,
yes,
and you compare that to the ideal profile, which is in all our scores,
yeah,
we are still a few percentages off.
yes.
What does that mean for the ideal, or what does it mean for this research?
Yeah, it's a good point. On the one hand, I think we always have to keep in mind there's going to be a gap between the reality of what's taking place in the business and what should be going on. I mean, kind of regardless of how much work we do, there's always going to be a bit of a gap there. The thing I liked about this, and speaking to your point, is it kind of goes back to one of the things that I talk about in accreditation. kind of regardless of what tool we're talking about. I have this silly rule of thumb that I always discuss, which refers to the 50th percentile on the circumplex. And that, you know, from my research perspective, being in the research department of HS for a long time and looking at culture and correlations and all that stuff, you know, one of the really interesting things that you just keep finding, especially when you do accreditations across levels, is that, you know, that 50th percentile ring is tremendously influential. And when we look at, for example, what we call comparative profiles, where you do something like look within organizations in terms of whatever, satisfaction or engagement, and then we cut sort of the top and bottom 15%, you know, you're done in a few different ways, but the simplest way to explain this, you know, we basically would take your top 15% most satisfied people, people who report that they're engaged, motivated, satisfied, and so on, versus the bottom 15% least satisfied, and then work back to look at how do these people experience the culture. We do that at the cultural level. We do the teams and individual levels. We do all sorts of different things. If you look at the GSI accreditations in terms of the teams that achieve synergy versus the teams that really underperform, the pattern you get again and again is really, you don't have to have the ideal blue historic ideal profile to be a very high performing individual team or organization. When we look consistently at the top 10, 15% performers, again, almost regardless of what that performance criteria is, and regardless of which level individuals, teams, leaders, culture you're looking into, the pattern is consistent. You know, if you want to be in the top 15%, 10, 15% of performers, you really need to have the profile at that level being predominantly constructive. All four of those constructive styles need to be at or beyond the 50th percentile, and all of the defensive styles typically need to be at or below the 50th percentile. And you get the opposite patterns for the opposite groups, meaning your bottom 10 or 15% performers will tend to have all of their defensive styles beyond the 50th percentile, all of them, and all of the constructive styles below the 50th percentile. And really all that's, I mean, at the end of the day, all that's really showing is that these individuals, teams, and businesses are predominantly using and emphasizing proactive, goal-oriented, problem-solving, learning, communicative, collaborative kinds of behaviors, and only secondarily falling into security-oriented, counterproductive norms. That's the function by which they are performing, and the reason that pattern is so consistent. I actually really like the message. I'm sorry, this is a long way to get back around to your point, but I actually really like that message because it shows clients you don't have to have your ideal profile or the historic ideal profile to have the kind of performance that you're shooting for. And while those gaps will always remain, and it also goes back to the compliance stage where we look at it, it's bad if it's not consistent with the ideal. If our current culture isn't what we said the ideal was, then that's wrong. And that's a very dangerous way to look at it. Because again, rather than learning from this and seeing, well, what can we do to improve, we're taking this as wrong, and that's something that we tend to process in more security-oriented ways. So yes, it's a trick to talk about ideals. I very much like to talk about the client's own ideal, but we need to keep in mind that that's a long-term goal, and that the other thing I talk to clients about is, you know, every step that you take toward that culture, that more constructive ideal, you'll see improvement along the way. And that's the other really nice thing to bring out to them. You don't have to get to that target to be high performing, and every step you take along the way to get there counts. Can I think of organizations that fit into each? Yes, I can. Industry, less so, but you know, industry is a thing that always comes up, and I won't go into the long discussion.
No, we agree on that. I said industries because I felt that we might not want to divulge any names that are sitting down in the sun.
Yeah. No. Well, but I mean, in some ways, yes, because what I have found is that in certain industries, it is less obvious to leaders how basically behavior and culture influences performance, right? So if you have a conversation with some, you know, people in education who, you know, have teachers, or you talk to people who run hospitals, who have nurses, they get that. They understand that, you know, how the nurse takes care of the patient and whether they listen to them or spend time with them has an effect on, well, most of them do, things like how well people feel there, and even how quickly they get better, and these sorts of things, versus other industries that maybe are manufacturing oriented and have a historic focus on, you know, efficiency, and don't sort of recognize the immediate influence that people have on the performance of their business. I think there is a thread of that, but to be honest with you, I get that less and less. More and more, you know, organizations, regardless of industry, especially now, get the fact that the way our people fulfill the strategy is critical to being successful. And we can have a great strategy and great systems, but if we don't have people proactively getting things done, solving problems, making decisions, all of that great strategy, and that goes back to the right culture eats strategy for breakfast topic, is for nothing. So yes, but I'm glad, I agree with you, glad you connect with this. I agree we'll need to put it in the accreditation material. It is super helpful to understand kind of where the client is and what pieces of information I need to give them at this stage, really. It's also, by the way, sorry, a great way to look at culture journeys moving forward. Because when I work with clients, honestly, in the back of my head, I'm oftentimes thinking, how do I get them to the next stage of consciousness by the end of this, right? So they're going to get their reports, and I need to debrief the compliant organization. They're only going to be interested in certain parts of that report, depending on where they are in this. And then how can I give them that information to get them up one step on that level? Is it possible to get from the lower stages to the highest stage without leadership development? That's a good question. I would be doubtful, to be honest with you. Now, there are some things, I mean, actually, if you look at those stages, some of the earlier stages, leaders either don't believe that culture is a thing, or they think it's just a nice thing to have, but don't really put much into it. So, or account much. Those are the projects that we typically get in touch with, not by leaders, but usually someone within HR or OD. And those are the projects that are typically outcome focused, you know, we're running into a problem, not across maybe the entire organization, but between two functional areas or in one part of the business, or there's one KPI that's really poor. We really need to improve our innovation or our customer focus or whatever, and we're struggling to understand why that's not working. Those organizations we can get into because we sort of have to force ourselves to answer their questions. We really could tell them so much more, but we need to focus on their question. So we try to do, in that case, a small project just for a part of the business, get enough data to run correlations with supplemental outcomes so we can show them not just that there is a culture in their business or in this part of it, but it is related to that criteria, that performance in this way, and start to answer. Now we're basically bringing them up to a compliance level. Culture exists, and we can see in data, and this is one of the real strengths of using good data, we can prove that A, you have a culture, what it is, and how it affects your performance. And that's answering some of the key questions at the bottom that make it harder for leaders to believe that culture is not important or just a nice to have. Now, all of a sudden, they have data showing that, you know, the sustainability of your business or your customer base or your critical performance is strongly correlated to your culture, and in this way. Then that sort of starts moving them up that ladder step by step. At some point, to answer your question, I'm sorry, at some point, I think they have to get involved. Right around the time you start breaking that, getting above the line to the point where we're not seeing culture as something to fix a problem. We're seeing it as a strategic part of our business that needs to not just be fixed by someone in HR, but needs to be led and maintained by leaders. Good. Any other questions? Fantastic. Okay. Well then, please don't forget to copy the link that I gave you at the beginning of the chat so you can have those files. If you come up with any questions at any point, please feel free to reach out. Happy to help. Hope this was interesting, and I hope to see you guys next Wednesday.